Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through the mists of medieval time, where we'll explore the remarkable life of a man whose name still echoes through history more than 12 centuries after his death. Tonight, our story unfolds in an age of darkness and light, of conquest and culture, where one extraordinary figure would reshape the very foundations of European civilization. Whether you're settling in for the evening or seeking gentle voices to guide you toward rest, I'm grateful you've chosen to join me on this voyage through the extraordinary world of Charlemagne. If this kind of soothing historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing for more journeys through the quiet corridors of the past. We have countless tales waiting to unfold in the gentle hours between waking and sleep. Have you ever wondered how a single individual could transform an entire continent from fragmented chaos into the foundation of modern Europe? The answer lies not in luck or circumstance, but in the methodical brilliance of a king who understood that true power comes not just from conquest, but from the patient work of building something that would endure long after the sword was sheathed. What I'm about to reveal will transform everything you thought you knew about the so-called Dark Ages. This wasn't simply a period of barbarism and ignorance, but rather a time of remarkable transformation, guided by a ruler whose vision extended far beyond the battlefield into the very soul of what it meant to be civilized. Today, I'm going to take you inside the world that shaped Charlemagne, introduce you to the forces that molded his character, and show you how a young Frankish prince became the architect of European identity itself. You'll discover how political genius combined with military prowess and cultural vision to create something unprecedented in human history. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just what Charlemagne accomplished, but why his legacy continues to influence our world today in ways both obvious and subtle. But before we witness the rise of this extraordinary monarch, let me paint you a picture of the world he was born into, a world teetering between the dying echoes of Rome and the uncertain dawn of something entirely new. The year was 742, though the people of that time would have measured it differently, perhaps as the 24th year of the reign of the Merovingian king Childeric III, or simply as another season in the endless cycle of planting and harvest that governed most human lives. The great Roman Empire, which had once stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, had been reduced to a memory in the West, its final emperor deposed just 2.5 centuries earlier. Yet the ghost of Rome haunted every corner of Europe. Its roads still carried merchants and pilgrims across vast distances. Its laws still governed disputes in countless communities. Its language, Latin, remained the tongue of learning and diplomacy. Most importantly, its Christian faith had taken deep root in lands that had once worshipped Jupiter and Mars, creating a new kind of unity that transcended the old tribal boundaries. Into this world of transformation was born Charles, later called Carolus Magnus, or Charlemagne, the Great Charles. His birthplace was likely Aachen, though some scholars suggest Liège, in the heart of what we now call the Low Countries. The exact location matters less than the world he entered, a realm where his grandfather, Charles Martel, had already begun the work of reshaping Frankish power. The Frankish kingdom of the 8th century was unlike anything we might recognize as a unified state today. Picture instead a complex web of personal loyalties, where power flowed not through institutions, but through relationships between individuals, bound by oaths of loyalty and mutual obligation. The king ruled not through bureaucracy, but through the force of his personality, the strength of his sword arm, and his ability to reward loyalty while punishing betrayal. Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, had earned his surname meaning the Hammer through his devastating victory over Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732. This triumph had not only halted the northward expansion of Islamic power into Europe, but had also established the Carolingian family as the true power behind the Merovingian throne. The official kings, descendants of the legendary Merovech, had become mere figureheads, their long hair and ceremonial authority masking their complete dependence on Carolingian support. This political arrangement, where one family held the crown while another wielded the power, created a fascinating dynamic that would profoundly influence young Charles's understanding of authority and legitimacy. From his earliest years, he observed how real power operated differently from official power, how respect was earned rather than inherited, and how effective leadership required constant demonstration of competence and strength. Pepin the Short, Charlemagne's father, had inherited Charles Martel's position as mayor of the palace, the official who supposedly served the Merovingian king, but actually controlled the kingdom's military and administrative functions. Pepin was a remarkable figure in his own right, possessed of both political cunning and genuine administrative ability. Unlike many strongmen who seize power through force alone, Pepin understood that lasting authority required more than military success. The world that shaped young Charles was one of constant warfare, but not the chaotic violence we might imagine. Medieval warfare, particularly among the Franks, followed certain patterns and customs that made it more predictable and, in some ways, more civilized than the conflicts that would follow in later centuries. Battles were seasonal affairs, conducted when weather permitted travel and when agricultural work did not require every available hand. More importantly, warfare served multiple functions beyond simple conquest. It was a means of demonstrating royal authority, of binding noble followers through shared danger and shared rewards, and of maintaining the military skills that every free Frankish man was expected to possess. Young nobles like Charles learned to fight, not as a separate skill but as part of their broader education in leadership and governance. The education of a Frankish prince in the 8th century encompassed far more than we might expect from what we sometimes call the Dark Ages. While formal literacy was not universal, even among the nobility, the curriculum for future leaders included military training, legal knowledge, diplomatic skills, and at least some familiarity with Christian theology and classical learning. Charles received instruction in Latin, the language of administration and scholarship, though he would always prefer his native Germanic tongue for daily conversation. Perhaps most importantly, Charles's education included extensive exposure to the practical realities of governance. He accompanied his father on military campaigns, observed diplomatic negotiations, and participated in the complex ceremonies that bound Frankish society together. This hands-on approach to learning would prove invaluable when he later faced the enormous challenges of ruling an empire that stretched across most of Western Europe. The religious dimension of Charles's upbringing deserves special attention, as it would profoundly influence every aspect of his later reign. The Frankish nobility had embraced Christianity with characteristic thoroughness, but their understanding of the faith combined Christian doctrine with Germanic traditions of honor, loyalty, and martial valor. This synthesis created a distinctive form of medieval Christianity that saw no contradiction between pious devotion and effective violence in service of righteous causes. The monastery of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, played a crucial role in Charles's early education. This ancient foundation, which claimed to house the remains of the patron saint of France, served as both a spiritual center and a repository of learning that connected the Frankish kingdom to the broader Christian world. The monks of Saint-Denis maintained libraries, operated schools, and provided the administrative expertise that the Carolingian court increasingly required. Through his exposure to monastic learning, Charles encountered ideas and texts that expanded his understanding far beyond the immediate concerns of Frankish politics. He learned about the great Christian emperors of the past, particularly Constantine and Justinian, who had combined temporal and spiritual authority in ways that suggested new possibilities for Christian kingship. He studied the works of church fathers like Augustine and Jerome, whose writings provided frameworks for understanding the relationship between earthly power and divine will. The economic foundations of the Frankish kingdom also shaped Charles's worldview in fundamental ways. Unlike the money-based economy of the old Roman Empire, 8th century Francia operated primarily through what historians call a gift economy, where relationships were cemented through the exchange of valuable objects rather than through monetary transactions. Kings demonstrated their power by their ability to give generously to their followers, while nobles proved their worth through their willingness to offer service and tribute to their superiors. This system created a dynamic where effective leadership required not just military success, but also the ability to acquire and distribute wealth on a scale that impressed contemporaries. Successful campaigns brought not only territorial expansion, but also the portable wealth needed to maintain the complex web of relationships that held the kingdom together. Charles learned early that generosity and strength were not opposing virtues, but complementary aspects of effective rule. The agricultural basis of Frankish society also influenced Charles's understanding of power and responsibility. The vast majority of his future subjects were peasants, whose primary concern was producing enough food to survive from one harvest to the next. Effective kingship required understanding these basic realities and ensuring that royal policies did not interfere with the agricultural cycles that sustained human life. This practical wisdom would later inform Charles's approach to governance, leading him to develop administrative systems that worked with rather than against the fundamental rhythms of medieval life. As Charles matured from childhood into adolescence, the political landscape of his world began to shift in ways that would create unprecedented opportunities for Carolingian expansion. The Lombard kingdom in northern Italy was struggling with internal divisions that weakened its ability to resist Frankish pressure. The Byzantine Empire, heir to the eastern half of the old Roman realm, was distracted by conflicts with Muslim powers and internal religious controversies. Most significantly, the papacy in Rome was beginning to seek new protectors as its traditional reliance on Byzantine support proved increasingly inadequate. These shifting dynamics created a perfect storm of opportunity that would eventually propel the young Charles toward a destiny none could have imagined. The Muslim conquests that had swept across North Africa and into Iberia were creating pressure along the Pyrenees, where Christian and Islamic civilizations met in an uneasy balance of trade, diplomacy, and occasional warfare. This southern frontier would become one of the defining features of Charles's later military career. But in his youth, it represented something more subtle, yet equally important: the reality that Christendom existed within a larger world where other faiths and cultures possessed their own forms of strength and sophistication. The intellectual climate of Charles's formative years was far richer than the term Dark Ages might suggest. While the great urban centers of classical antiquity had indeed declined, new forms of learning were emerging in monasteries, cathedral schools, and royal courts throughout Western Europe. Irish monks, renowned for their scholarship, carried manuscripts and ideas across vast distances, creating networks of intellectual exchange that connected isolated communities to broader currents of thought and discovery. Charles encountered this intellectual ferment through his contact with scholars who served his father's court. These learned men, many of them clerics, brought together Christian theology, classical philosophy, and practical knowledge in ways that would have been impossible during the height of Roman power. They translated Greek texts into Latin, copied and preserved ancient works that might otherwise have been lost, and developed new approaches to education that would eventually transform European culture. The young prince's exposure to these intellectual currents shaped his understanding of leadership in profound ways. He learned that effective rule required not just physical courage and political cunning, but also the ability to attract and retain talented advisors who could provide expertise in areas beyond any single individual's competence. This lesson would prove crucial when he later faced the challenge of governing territories whose customs, languages, and traditions differed dramatically from those of his Frankish heartland. Music and poetry held special significance in Charles's education, reflecting the Germanic tradition that valued skilled performers who could preserve and transmit the stories that bound communities together. The great deeds of past heroes lived on in songs that were performed at feasts and gatherings, creating a shared cultural memory that transcended the boundaries between different tribes and regions. Charles developed a deep appreciation for this oral tradition, understanding how narrative and rhythm could shape collective identity in ways that written law and formal decree could not achieve. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life also influenced Charles's developing worldview. Spring brought the renewal of military campaigns as roads became passable and supplies more readily available. Summer was the time of greatest activity, when armies could move freely and when the business of governance required constant attention. Autumn meant harvest time, when the success or failure of crops determined whether communities would thrive or struggle through the coming winter. Winter imposed its own discipline, forcing even the most powerful nobles to focus on survival and preparation for the challenges of the coming year. These natural cycles created a framework for leadership that emphasized patience, timing, and the careful husbanding of resources. Charles learned to think in terms of long-term consequences rather than immediate gratification, understanding that decisions made in one season would inevitably influence possibilities and constraints in seasons yet to come. This temporal perspective would later enable him to undertake projects that required sustained effort over many years, from military campaigns that unfolded across decades to educational reforms that would bear fruit only in the next generation. The role of women in Frankish society, while limited by the standards of later ages, was nonetheless significant enough to influence Charles's understanding of power and alliance. Noble women could inherit property, arrange marriages, and exercise considerable influence within their households and extended families. Charles's own mother, Bertrada of Laon, played an active role in the political calculations that shaped Carolingian policy, demonstrating that effective leadership often required the ability to work with and through female networks of influence. The marriage politics of the 8th century were particularly complex, involving not just personal relationships, but also territorial claims, military alliances, and religious considerations. Charles observed how his father navigated these treacherous waters, balancing the need for useful alliances against the requirements of Christian marriage law and the practical limitations of medieval communication and transportation. These lessons in diplomatic marriage would later serve Charles well as he sought to consolidate his conquests through carefully chosen matrimonial connections. Trade relationships also played a crucial role in shaping the world of Charles's youth. Despite the political fragmentation that followed Rome's collapse, commercial networks continued to operate across vast distances, carrying not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Merchants from Byzantine territories brought silk and spices northward, while Frankish traders carried amber, furs, and manufactured goods southward toward the Mediterranean. These exchanges created a web of interdependence that transcended political boundaries and provided aspiring rulers with both opportunities and vulnerabilities. The monetary systems of this period reflected the transitional nature of early medieval society. While Roman coins continued to circulate, their value often depended more on the silver content than on the authority of long-dead emperors. Local rulers began minting their own currency, creating a complex patchwork of competing standards that made long-distance trade challenging, but not impossible. Charles learned to think about wealth in multiple forms: land that produced agricultural surplus, precious metals that could be coined or fashioned into gifts, and the loyalty of followers who could provide military service when needed. Religious festivals and ceremonies punctuated the calendar with moments of special significance that reinforced social bonds and political relationships. Christmas and Easter were not merely personal observances, but community events that brought together people from different social levels in shared celebration and worship. These occasions provided opportunities for rulers to demonstrate their piety, generosity, and connection to divine authority, while also allowing them to gauge the mood of their subjects and the loyalty of their supporters. The cult of saints held particular importance in this religious landscape, creating networks of devotion that crossed political boundaries and provided alternative forms of authority and legitimacy. Relics of martyrs and holy men were believed to possess miraculous powers that could protect communities, heal the sick, and ensure victory in battle. Charles learned to appreciate both the spiritual significance of these beliefs and their practical utility in binding diverse populations together under common symbols and narratives. Pilgrimage was another important aspect of medieval religious life that influenced Charles's understanding of his world. The journey to sacred sites was considered both a spiritual discipline and a form of penance that could expiate sins and demonstrate devotion. These religious travels created opportunities for cultural exchange and political negotiation, as pilgrims from different kingdoms encountered each other along the ancient roads that still connected distant regions of former Roman territory. The legal traditions that governed Frankish society were equally complex, combining Roman law, Germanic custom, and Christian doctrine in ways that reflected the hybrid nature of early medieval civilization. Different communities often followed different legal codes, creating a patchwork of jurisdictions that required skilled arbitration and careful negotiation. Charles observed how his father dealt with these complexities, learning that effective rule often meant finding ways to honor diverse traditions while maintaining sufficient consistency to prevent chaos and confusion. As Charles approached adulthood, the political situation in Francia was becoming increasingly unstable in ways that would soon create unprecedented opportunities for Carolingian advancement. The last Merovingian kings were proving utterly incapable of providing the leadership that the kingdom required, while external threats from Muslim raiders, Germanic tribes, and Byzantine political interference demanded responses that only strong unified leadership could provide. The stage was being set for a transformation that would reshape not just the Frankish kingdom, but the entire character of European civilization. The young man who had learned statecraft at his father's side, who had absorbed the wisdom of monastic schools and the practical knowledge of military camps, who understood both the spiritual aspirations and material needs of his people, was about to embark on a career that would justify his later title as the Father of Europe. But first, Charles would need to survive the dangerous transition from prince to king, navigate the treacherous politics of succession, and prove that the lessons of his youth could be transformed into the practical wisdom needed to rule an empire that did not yet exist but was waiting to be born from his vision, determination, and unmatched ability to inspire loyalty among those who chose to follow him into an uncertain but promising future. The death of Pepin the Short in 768 marked the beginning of one of history's most consequential power struggles, though few at the time could have anticipated the magnitude of what was about to unfold. According to Frankish custom, the kingdom was divided between Pepin's two sons. Charles, now 26 years old, received the northern and western portions of the realm, while his younger brother Charlemagne inherited the southeastern territories that bordered the Lombard Kingdom of Italy. This division created immediate tensions that threatened to tear apart everything the Carolingian family had spent generations building. The two brothers possessed fundamentally different temperaments and approaches to leadership. Charles was bold, expansive in his thinking, and possessed of an almost supernatural energy that seemed to radiate from his imposing physical presence. Contemporary sources describe him as unusually tall for his era, standing nearly 6.5 feet in height, with piercing blue eyes and a commanding voice that could be heard across a battlefield or a great hall filled with nobles. Charlemagne, by contrast, was more cautious and contemplative, deeply religious in a way that sometimes bordered on asceticism. Where Charles saw opportunities for expansion and conquest, Charlemagne perceived risks and complications that might threaten the stability of their father's legacy. These differences in personality might have been manageable in other circumstances, but the realities of 8th century politics made cooperation between the brothers essential for survival. The Lombard question dominated the early years of Charles's reign in ways that would have profound consequences for the future of Europe. The Lombard kingdom, centered in northern Italy, had been expanding southward toward papal territories, creating a crisis that demanded immediate attention from the Christian powers of the north. Pope Stephen III, faced with the prospect of Lombard domination over Rome itself, appealed desperately to the Frankish brothers for military assistance. This papal appeal created a dilemma that perfectly illustrated the complex relationship between temporal and spiritual authority in medieval Europe. The Pope possessed enormous moral influence, but lacked the military resources to defend his territories. The Frankish kings commanded powerful armies, but needed papal approval to legitimize their authority over newly conquered Christian populations. The interdependence was obvious, but the practical mechanics of cooperation proved extraordinarily difficult to negotiate. Charles favored immediate intervention in Italy, seeing an opportunity to expand Frankish influence while fulfilling what he perceived as Christian duty to protect the church. Charlemagne urged caution, fearing that military adventures in distant territories might weaken their defenses against more immediate threats from Germanic tribes along the eastern frontier. The disagreement between the brothers created a diplomatic paralysis that frustrated papal representatives and encouraged Lombard aggression. The situation became even more complex when Desiderius, the Lombard king, attempted to exploit the division between the Frankish brothers through a sophisticated diplomatic strategy that combined marriage alliances with territorial concessions. He offered to arrange marriages between his daughters and members of the Carolingian family, while simultaneously proposing territorial exchanges that would have given the Lombards greater security in their southern expansion. These negotiations revealed Charles's growing sophistication as a political strategist. Rather than rejecting Lombard overtures outright, he engaged in extended discussions that allowed him to gather intelligence about Lombard military capabilities and internal politics, while avoiding premature commitment to any particular course of action. This diplomatic maneuvering demonstrated that Charles had learned well from his father's example, understanding that effective leadership often required patience and careful calculation rather than immediate action. The death of Charlemagne in December 771 transformed the political landscape overnight, eliminating the division that had paralyzed Frankish policy and providing Charles with an opportunity to demonstrate the qualities that would define his entire reign. Rather than allowing Charlemagne's territories to pass to his infant sons, as Frankish law technically required, Charles moved with lightning speed to claim the entire Carolingian inheritance for himself. This decisive action revealed the calculating intelligence beneath Charles's warrior exterior. He understood that divided authority would invite external intervention and internal rebellion, while unified leadership under his control could provide the strength necessary to address the multiple challenges facing the Frankish realm. The speed and efficiency with which he consolidated power demonstrated organizational capabilities that would later enable him to govern territories spanning from the Atlantic to the Danube. The elimination of internal division also allowed Charles to address the Italian situation with characteristic decisiveness. In 773, responding to renewed papal appeals for assistance against Lombard aggression, he launched the first of many campaigns that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in medieval Europe. The decision to intervene in Italy was not merely reactive, but reflected a broader strategic vision that saw the peninsula as essential to any lasting expansion of Frankish influence. The logistics of moving a substantial Frankish army across the Alps represented a formidable challenge that tested every aspect of Charles's leadership abilities. Medieval armies depended entirely on local resources for sustenance, making long-distance campaigns exercises in improvised supply management as much as military strategy. Charles had to coordinate the movement of thousands of warriors, their equipment, and their support personnel across mountain passes that had challenged even Roman legions at the height of their power. The successful completion of this Alpine crossing demonstrated organizational capabilities that contemporaries found almost miraculous. Charles had not only moved his army intact across treacherous terrain, but had done so quickly enough to achieve tactical surprise against Lombard defenders who had assumed the mountains provided adequate protection against northern invasion. This achievement established Charles's reputation as a military genius whose capabilities extended far beyond personal courage or tactical insight. The siege of Pavia, the Lombard capital, became a masterclass in medieval warfare that revealed Charles's understanding of both military science and psychological pressure. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults against the city's formidable fortifications, Charles established a comprehensive blockade that gradually strangled Lombard resistance while minimizing Frankish casualties. The siege lasted nearly a year, during which Charles demonstrated the patience and persistence that would characterize all his major undertakings. During the long months outside Pavia, Charles used the enforced delay to study Lombard society and culture with the thoroughness that would become his trademark approach to governing conquered territories. He learned about local laws and customs, identified potential allies among the Lombard nobility, and developed administrative plans for integrating the kingdom into the expanding Frankish realm. This preparation proved invaluable when Pavia finally surrendered in June 774. The fall of the Lombard kingdom marked Charles's transformation from regional Frankish king into a European power whose influence extended across the former heartland of the Western Roman Empire. His assumption of the Lombard crown demonstrated political sophistication that combined military conquest with legal legitimacy, as he claimed authority not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful successor to Desiderius through the established procedures of Lombard succession law. More significantly, Charles's Italian victory established a new relationship with the papacy that would have profound implications for the development of medieval Christianity. By eliminating the Lombard threat to papal territories, Charles became the Church's primary temporal protector, a role that brought both enormous influence and equally enormous responsibilities. The Pope could now rely on Frankish military power to defend Christian interests, while Charles gained access to the moral authority and administrative expertise that the Church had preserved from the classical world. The integration of Lombard territories into the Frankish realm required administrative innovations that revealed Charles's growing understanding of the complexities involved in governing diverse populations across vast distances. Unlike previous Frankish conquests, which had typically involved the displacement or assimilation of defeated peoples, the Italian situation demanded more subtle approaches that could preserve local traditions while ensuring ultimate Frankish authority. Charles's solution involved the creation of hybrid administrative structures that combined Frankish oversight with Lombard local governance. He appointed Frankish nobles to key military and political positions, while allowing Lombard administrators to continue managing day-to-day affairs according to established customs and procedures. This flexible approach demonstrated remarkable political maturity, showing that Charles understood the difference between conquest and effective rule. The success of these administrative experiments in Italy provided templates that Charles would later adapt for use in other conquered territories throughout his expanding realm. The principle of combining central authority with local autonomy became a hallmark of Carolingian governance, enabling Charles to rule effectively over populations whose languages, customs, and traditions differed dramatically from those of his Frankish heartland. The wealth extracted from the Lombard kingdom also provided Charles with resources necessary to undertake even more ambitious projects. The treasure accumulated by generations of Lombard kings, combined with the ongoing revenues from Italian commerce and agriculture, gave Charles financial capabilities that far exceeded anything available to previous Frankish rulers. This wealth would prove essential for maintaining the expanded military forces necessary to defend his growing territories, while also funding the cultural and educational initiatives that would become equally important aspects of his legacy. Perhaps most importantly, The Italian campaign established Charles's reputation throughout Europe as a ruler whose capabilities transcended traditional limitations of medieval kingship. His successful Alpine crossing, patient siege warfare, and sophisticated post-conquest administration demonstrated that he possessed both the vision to conceive ambitious projects and the practical skills necessary to bring them to successful completion. Word of these achievements spread through the networks of merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats who maintained communication across medieval Europe, creating expectations that would both challenge and inspire Charles in the years ahead. The transformation from Frankish king to European emperor had begun, though Charles himself may not yet have fully grasped the implications of what he had set in motion. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom was not merely another successful military campaign, but the first step in a process that would ultimately recreate something approaching the old Roman Empire under Christian auspices and Germanic leadership. But even as Charles savoured his Italian triumph, new challenges were emerging along other frontiers of his expanding realm. Saxon tribes beyond the Rhine were becoming increasingly aggressive in their resistance to Frankish expansion, while Muslim forces in Spain represented both threat and opportunity for a ruler whose ambitions were beginning to match his demonstrated capabilities. The stage was being set for conflicts that would test every lesson Charles had learned about warfare, diplomacy, and governance, while simultaneously providing opportunities for achievements that would establish his reputation as one of history's most consequential rulers. The young man, who had inherited a divided Frankish kingdom, was rapidly becoming the architect of a new European order that would influence the development of Western civilization for centuries to come. Civilization for centuries to come. The Saxon wars that would consume the next 3 decades of Charles's reign began almost by accident, yet they would prove to be the defining struggle of his entire career. Unlike his swift conquest of the Lombards, the Saxon conflict would test his patience, his strategic thinking, and his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a Christian emperor in ways that no previous challenge had attempted. The Saxon territories stretched across the vast forests and marshlands between the Rhine and Elbe rivers, encompassing lands that had never known Roman rule and whose inhabitants had maintained their ancient Germanic customs with fierce independence for centuries. These were not the civilized kingdoms of Italy or Gaul, with their cities, written laws, and established hierarchies, but rather a collection of tribal confederations whose primary bonds were kinship, shared ritual, and common resistance to foreign domination. The Saxons posed a unique challenge that Charles had not encountered in his previous campaigns. They possessed no central authority that could surrender on behalf of all Saxon peoples, no capital city whose capture would end resistance, no king whose defeat would ensure lasting peace. Instead, Saxon society was organized around numerous tribal groups, each with its own leaders, its own sacred sites, and its own understanding of honor and obligation that made accommodation with Frankish authority extremely difficult to achieve. The religious dimension of the Saxon conflict added layers of complexity that transformed what might have been a conventional territorial dispute into something approaching a holy war. The Saxons remained devoted to their ancestral gods, worshipping in sacred groves and maintaining religious practices that Christians considered not merely mistaken but actively demonic. Their great sacred pillar, the Irminsul, served as both a religious symbol and a focus of tribal identity that represented everything. Frankish Christianity sought to replace Charles's first Saxon campaign in 772, began with characteristic decisiveness, but revealed the limitations of conventional military strategy when applied to unconventional opponents. His forces penetrated deep into Saxon territory, destroying the Irminsul and capturing significant amounts of treasure. Yet these apparent victories produced no lasting submission. The Saxons simply melted away before superior Frankish forces, only to reappear once the invaders had withdrawn to deal with other pressing concerns. This pattern of advance and retreat, victory and renewed resistance would characterize the Saxon wars for decades to come. Charles would win battles, capture territory, and extract oaths of submission, only to discover that Saxon leaders considered these agreements void once Frankish armies had departed. The Saxons fought according to their own understanding of warfare, which emphasized survival and eventual victory over immediate tactical success. The most formidable Saxon leader to emerge during these conflicts was Widukind, a nobleman whose name would become synonymous with resistance to Frankish domination. Widukind possessed the rare combination of military skill and political intelligence that enabled him to coordinate Saxon resistance across tribal boundaries, creating a unified opposition that Charles had not anticipated when he first crossed the Rhine. More importantly, Widukind understood that defeating Charles required more than military success. It demanded the kind of sustained resistance that would exhaust Frankish resources and patience. The strategic intelligence that Widukind demonstrated throughout the Saxon wars rivaled anything Charles had encountered in his previous campaigns. Rather than attempting to match Frankish advantages in heavy cavalry and siege warfare, Widukind developed tactics that exploited Saxon familiarity with local terrain, while avoiding the kind of decisive battles that had secured Charles's victories elsewhere. Saxon forces would strike suddenly at Frankish supply lines, disappear into forests that offered perfect concealment, and reappear wherever they were least expected. These guerrilla tactics forced Charles to develop new approaches to warfare that tested his adaptability as a military commander. The lessons learned in Italy, where patient siege warfare had eventually overcome Lombard resistance, proved inadequate for dealing with enemies who refused to defend fixed positions or acknowledge defeat after losing individual battles. Charles had to learn to think like his opponents, anticipating their movements and gradually restricting their options through sustained pressure rather than decisive confrontation. The administrative challenges posed by Saxon resistance were equally complex. Charles could conquer Saxon territory and establish Frankish garrisons, but maintaining control required constant vigilance and enormous resources. Every Frankish settlement in Saxon lands needed protection, every Christian missionary required military escort, and every attempt to impose Frankish law met with passive or active resistance that threatened to undermine the entire project of integration. The religious conversion of the Saxons became central to Charles's strategy for ending the conflict, though his approach to this spiritual conquest revealed tensions between Christian ideals and political necessities that would influence medieval attitudes toward conversion for centuries to come. Charles understood that military victory alone would never produce lasting Saxon submission. Only by transforming Saxon religious beliefs could he hope to integrate these proud peoples into his expanding Christian empire. The missionaries who accompanied Charles's armies into Saxon territory faced dangers and difficulties that tested their faith as thoroughly as any martyrdom. They worked among populations that viewed Christianity not merely as a foreign religion, but as a direct assault on the spiritual foundations of Saxon identity. Every church they built, every baptism they performed, every sacred grove they destroyed, represented a victory in a cosmic struggle that both sides understood would determine the future character of Central Europe. The brutal realities of forced conversion created moral dilemmas that Charles addressed with characteristic pragmatism, though his solutions would later be criticized by those who preferred more gentle approaches to Christian evangelization. He established laws that made practicing Saxon religion punishable by death, while offering material rewards for conversion and cooperation with Frankish authorities. This combination of threat and incentive reflected Charles's understanding that changing deeply held religious beliefs required more than theological argument or missionary enthusiasm. The massacre at Verdun in 782 represented the darkest moment of the Saxon Wars and revealed the lengths to which Charles would go to secure Saxon submission. When Saxon forces under Widukind's leadership destroyed a Frankish army and killed several prominent nobles, Charles responded with unprecedented brutality, ordering the execution of thousands of Saxon prisoners in a single day. This atrocity demonstrated that the patient, calculating ruler who had successfully integrated the Lombard kingdom could also employ terror as an instrument of policy when circumstances seemed to demand it. The immediate aftermath of Verdun showed both the effectiveness and the limitations of extreme measures in medieval warfare. Saxon resistance temporarily collapsed as tribal leaders recognized the consequences of continued defiance, yet the massacre also created lasting resentment that would fuel future rebellions and complicate Charles's efforts to win Saxon hearts, as well as their nominal submission. The memory of Verdun would haunt Saxon-Frankish relations for generations, serving as evidence that Charles's empire rested ultimately on force rather than genuine consent. Yet Charles also demonstrated remarkable capacity for learning from his mistakes and adapting his strategies in response to changing circumstances. The years following Verdun saw him develop more sophisticated approaches to Saxon integration that combined military pressure with economic incentives and cultural accommodation. Rather than simply demanding immediate and complete transformation of Saxon society, Charles began working with Saxon leaders who were willing to accept Christian baptism while maintaining many of their traditional roles and privileges. The gradual emergence of a Saxon Christian nobility represented one of Charles's most significant achievements in the art of medieval statecraft. By identifying Saxon leaders who could serve as intermediaries between Frankish authority and Saxon communities, Charles created the foundation for lasting integration that went beyond mere military occupation. These converted Saxon nobles retained enough of their traditional authority to command respect among their people, while accepting enough Christian and Frankish influence to serve effectively as agents of imperial policy. The economic transformation of Saxon territories under Frankish rule also contributed to the gradual pacification of this troubled frontier. Charles introduced new agricultural techniques, established trading centres, and encouraged the development of crafts and commerce that provided Saxon communities with alternatives to their traditional reliance on warfare and raiding. The material benefits of participation in the Frankish economy created incentives for cooperation that complemented the spiritual and political pressures toward integration. The construction of churches and monasteries throughout Saxon lands served multiple purposes in Charles's grand strategy for regional transformation. These religious institutions provided centers for Christian worship and education, but they also served as fortified strongpoints that could anchor Frankish control over surrounding territories. The monks who staffed these foundations became agents of cultural change, who worked to replace Saxon customs with Christian alternatives, while also serving as sources of intelligence about local conditions and potential threats. The educational initiatives that Charles established in Saxon territories revealed his understanding that lasting conversion required more than superficial acceptance of Christian symbols and ceremonies. Schools attached to churches and monasteries provided Saxon children with literacy in Christian doctrine, while also teaching them Latin and the administrative skills necessary for participation in Frankish governmental systems. These educational programs created a generation of Saxon Christians who possessed both the knowledge and the cultural orientation necessary for genuine integration into Charles's expanding empire. The marriage alliances that Charles arranged between Frankish and Saxon noble families represented another dimension of his comprehensive approach to regional integration. These matrimonial connections created bonds of kinship that transcended ethnic and religious boundaries, while also providing Saxon families with access to Frankish wealth and influence. The children of these mixed marriages grew up as Christians who inherited both Saxon and Frankish identities, becoming natural bridges between the two cultures. The legal innovations that Charles developed for governing Saxon territories demonstrated his growing sophistication as a creator of institutions that could function effectively across cultural boundaries. Rather than simply imposing Frankish law on Saxon communities, Charles created hybrid legal systems that preserved Saxon customs in areas like property rights and family relationships, while insisting on Frankish and Christian standards in matters relating to religion and royal authority. These legal compromises required careful negotiation and constant adjustment as Charles learned more about Saxon society and as Saxon leaders became more familiar with Frankish expectations. The process created precedents for governing diverse populations that would influence imperial administration throughout Charles's realm and establish patterns that would persist long after his death. The successful integration of Saxon territories into the Carolingian Empire represented a triumph of patient diplomacy and cultural flexibility that complemented Charles's more famous military achievements. The final submission of Widukind in 785 marked the symbolic end of Saxon independence and the beginning of a new era in the relationship between Germanic and Christian civilizations. Widukind's conversion and baptism, with Charles serving as his godfather, demonstrated that even the most determined opponents could eventually be brought into the Christian fold through the combination of pressure and persuasion that characterized Charles's mature approach to conquest and conversion. Yet the Saxon Wars had also transformed Charles himself in ways that would influence every aspect of his subsequent reign. The decades of conflict had tested his patience, his strategic thinking, and his understanding of the relationship between military force and political authority in ways that no previous challenge had attempted. The lessons learned in the Saxon forests and marshlands would inform his approach to governing an empire that now stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe and from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The successful conclusion of the Saxon Wars also provided Charles with the security and confidence necessary to undertake even more ambitious projects that would establish his reputation as one of history's most consequential rulers. With his northern and eastern frontiers finally secure, Charles could turn his attention to the cultural and educational initiatives that would earn him recognition as the father of European learning and the creator of what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. But even as Charles celebrated his Saxon triumph, new challenges and opportunities were emerging that would test his abilities as a ruler and a Christian emperor in ways that would ultimately lead to his coronation as Roman emperor and his recognition as the heir to Augustus Caesar himself. The Spanish frontier beckoned to Charles with promises both glorious and treacherous, offering opportunities that would test his expanding vision of Christian empire against the sophisticated Islamic civilization that had flourished in Iberia for nearly 7 decades. The Muslim conquest of Visigothic Spain in 711 had created a complex political landscape where Christian, Jewish, and Islamic communities coexisted under Umayyad rule, generating wealth and cultural achievements that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The call for Frankish intervention came from an unexpected source: Sulayman ibn al-Arabi, the Muslim governor of Barcelona, who found himself in rebellion against the Umayyad emir Abd al-Rahman I in Córdoba. This invitation from a Muslim leader to assist in what was essentially a civil war within Islamic Spain presented Charles with diplomatic and strategic opportunities, unlike anything he had previously encountered. Here was a chance to expand Christian influence southward while exploiting divisions within the Islamic world. Charles's decision to intervene in Spanish affairs reflected his growing confidence as a European power broker and his increasingly sophisticated understanding of the complex relationships between religion, politics, and military strategy. The expedition he planned for 778 would be unlike his previous campaigns, requiring him to navigate not only military challenges but also the delicate diplomacy of alliance with Muslim partners against Muslim enemies. The army that Charles assembled for his Spanish campaign represented the full power of his expanding empire. Frankish heavy cavalry formed the core of his forces, but he also brought Lombard infantry, Saxon auxiliaries who had recently submitted to his authority, and various allied contingents from throughout his territories. This multinational force reflected the transformation of Frankish military organization from a tribal warband into an imperial army capable of projecting power across vast distances. The logistics of moving this substantial force across the Pyrenees and into hostile territory required organizational capabilities that few medieval rulers possessed. Charles had to coordinate supplies, establish communication lines, and plan for contingencies in terrain that offered both opportunities and dangers for an invading army. The mountain passes that provided access to Spain could easily become traps if defended by determined opponents or blocked by adverse weather. The initial phases of the Spanish campaign proceeded according to plan, with Charles's forces successfully crossing the Pyrenees and advancing toward their primary objectives. Pamplona, the principal city of the Basque regions, fell to Frankish assault, providing Charles with a strategic base for further operations, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of his military machine against Spanish defenses. The ease of these early victories may have contributed to a sense of confidence that would later prove misplaced. The siege of Zaragoza, however, revealed the limitations of Charles's intelligence about Spanish conditions and the reliability of his Muslim allies. Sulayman ibn al-Arabi had promised that the city would open its gates to Frankish forces, but the actual defenders proved far more determined in their resistance than anyone had anticipated. The siege dragged on for weeks without achieving the quick victory that Charles had expected, consuming supplies and testing the patience of his multinational army. More troubling still were the reports reaching Charles about developments elsewhere in his empire. Saxon unrest was increasing along the Rhine frontier, requiring immediate attention to prevent a general rebellion that could undo years of patient conquest and conversion. The Lombard nobles in Italy were showing signs of restiveness that suggested they might attempt to exploit Charles's absence to reassert their independence. These multiple pressures forced Charles to make difficult strategic decisions about priorities and resource allocation. The decision to abandon the Spanish campaign and return to address more pressing concerns elsewhere demonstrated Charles's maturity as a strategic thinker who understood that successful empire required the ability to recognize when ambitions exceeded capabilities rather than persisting with a siege that showed little prospect of quick success. Charles chose to consolidate his existing conquests while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to emerging threats. The withdrawal from Spain, however, would become one of the most traumatic experiences of Charles's entire military career, transforming what should have been a routine strategic redeployment into a disaster that would resonate through European literature for centuries to come. The Basque ambush at Roncevaux Pass on August 15th, 778, represented a complete intelligence failure that caught Charles's forces unprepared for an attack they should have anticipated. The Basques who struck at Charles's rearguard were not motivated by religious or political ideology, but by the practical concerns of mountain peoples who had suffered from Frankish occupation and saw an opportunity to extract revenge while acquiring valuable plunder. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain, combined with their determination to punish the invaders who had destroyed Pamplona, created conditions perfect for the kind of ambush warfare that had proved so effective against Roman legions centuries earlier. The battle itself was brief but devastating, with Basque forces using the narrow confines of the mountain pass to negate Frankish advantages in heavy cavalry while maximizing their own superiority in mobility and local knowledge. The Frankish rearguard, laden with treasure from their Spanish expedition and unprepared for serious resistance, found themselves trapped in terrain that offered no opportunity for organized defense or effective counterattack. Among the fallen at Roncevaux was Roland, the Breton March warden whose death would inspire the greatest epic poem of medieval Europe. Though the historical Roland was probably a relatively minor figure in Charles's administration, his heroic last stand against overwhelming odds captured imaginations in ways that transform military disaster into cultural triumph. The Song of Roland would eventually present the ambush as a glorious Christian martyrdom rather than a tactical defeat, demonstrating how medieval culture could transmute political failure into spiritual victory. The immediate aftermath of Roncevaux tested Charles's leadership in ways that revealed both his emotional resilience and his political sophistication. The loss of trusted subordinates and valuable treasure was personally devastating, but Charles understood that showing weakness or despair could encourage further challenges to his authority throughout the empire. He absorbed the blow with outward stoicism, while privately learning lessons about intelligence gathering and military planning that would inform all his subsequent campaigns. The strategic implications of the Spanish disaster extended far beyond the immediate military losses, forcing Charles to reconsider his approach to expansion and consolidation throughout his growing empire. The failure demonstrated that even the most powerful medieval ruler faced limitations that required careful respect, and that success in one theatre of operations did not guarantee similar results in different circumstances with different opponents. Yet Charles's response to the Roncesvalles disaster also revealed the qualities that would ultimately establish his reputation as one of history's greatest rulers. Rather than allowing the defeat to paralyze his decision-making or discourage future ambitious undertakings, he absorbed the lessons of failure while maintaining the confident leadership that his empire required. The setback became an education rather than a catastrophe, strengthening his understanding of the complexities involved in governing diverse populations across vast territories. The years following the Spanish expedition saw Charles applying these hard-won insights to other frontier challenges that tested his evolving understanding of imperial strategy and Christian mission. The Avar threat in the east represented a different kind of challenge from anything he had previously encountered, involving opponents whose nomadic lifestyle and military capabilities demanded innovative approaches to warfare and diplomacy. The Avars had established a formidable confederation centered in the Pannonian Plain, from which they had launched devastating raids throughout Central Europe for more than 2 centuries. Their military effectiveness rested on superior cavalry tactics and their ability to coordinate operations across vast distances, making them perhaps the most dangerous opponents Charles would face during his entire reign. Unlike the Saxons, who fought to preserve their independence, or the Lombards, who defended established kingdoms, the Avars represented a nomadic challenge that threatened the very foundations of settled Christian civilization. The wealth accumulated by generations of Avar raiding had created what contemporary sources called the Ring, a vast fortified complex that served as both treasury and strategic center for Avar operations. The treasure stored within this fortress represented centuries of plunder extracted from Byzantine, Frankish, and other European targets, making its capture a prize that could fund Charles's expanding governmental and military operations for decades to come. The Avar campaigns that Charles launched beginning in 791 demonstrated his growing mastery of the logistical and strategic challenges involved in projecting power across vast distances against highly mobile opponents. These operations required coordination between multiple armies, operating from different directions, sophisticated intelligence gathering about Avar movements and intentions, and careful timing to prevent Avar forces from simply withdrawing beyond Frankish reach. The successful destruction of the Avar Confederation and the capture of the Ring's treasure represented one of Charles's most complete military triumphs, eliminating a threat that had plagued Europe for generations while providing resources that would enable even more ambitious projects in the years ahead. The victory also demonstrated Charles's evolution as a military commander who could adapt his tactics and strategy to meet the specific challenges posed by different types of opponents. More significantly, the Avar success established Charles's reputation throughout Europe as a ruler whose capabilities transcended regional limitations and approached something resembling universal Christian leadership. The elimination of the last major non-Christian power in Central Europe created conditions that would eventually lead to his recognition as Roman Emperor and his acceptance as the legitimate heir to imperial traditions that stretched back to Augustus Caesar. The cultural and intellectual developments that accompanied Charles's military successes during this period revealed another dimension of his vision for Christian empire that extended far beyond conquest and territorial expansion. The scholars, artists, and administrators who gathered at his court were creating new forms of learning and cultural expression that would influence European development for centuries to come, establishing patterns of intellectual life that would eventually earn Charles recognition as the father of the Carolingian Renaissance. The palace school that Charles established at Aachen became a center of learning that attracted the finest minds from throughout Europe. creating an intellectual community that combined Christian theology with classical learning in ways that had not been attempted since the fall of Rome. The curriculum developed at this institution provided models for education that would spread throughout Charles's empire and beyond, establishing foundations for the medieval university system that would emerge in later centuries. The manuscript copying and preservation projects that Charles sponsored represented equally important contributions to European cultural development, ensuring the survival of classical texts that might otherwise have been lost during the political upheavals of the early medieval period. The standardized script that his scholars developed improved the accuracy and legibility of copied texts, while also creating visual symbols of imperial unity that reinforced political messages through cultural means. The architectural projects that Charles undertook during this period reflected his growing understanding of the relationship between physical spaces and political authority, creating monuments that would serve both practical governmental functions and symbolic representations of imperial power. The palace complex at Aachen, with its distinctive chapel modelled on Byzantine and Roman precedents, established architectural standards that would influence church and palace construction throughout medieval Europe. Yet even as Charles celebrated these cultural achievements and military triumphs, events were unfolding in distant Rome that would soon transform his understanding of his own role in Christian history and European development. The papacy was facing challenges that would require intervention from the most powerful Christian ruler in Europe, creating opportunities for Charles to assume responsibilities and privileges that would ultimately lead to his coronation as Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. The stage was being set for the most significant moment in Charles's remarkable career, when the Frankish king who had begun his reign ruling a divided inheritance would receive recognition as the legitimate successor to the Caesars and the protector of Christian civilization throughout the known world. The papal crisis that would transform Charlemagne into Roman emperor began with events so seemingly mundane that few observers could have predicted their world-changing consequences. Pope Leo III had ascended to the papal throne in December 795, following the death of Adrian I, who had been Charles's trusted ally and correspondent for over 2 decades. Adrian's passing marked the end of an era in papal-Frankish relations, creating uncertainties that ambitious Roman nobles were eager to exploit. Leo faced immediate challenges to his authority that reflected the complex political dynamics of 8th century Rome. The city that had once commanded a Mediterranean empire had become a relatively small ecclesiastical state surrounded by hostile powers and torn by internal factions, whose loyalties shifted with bewildering frequency. The papal court was dominated by noble families who viewed church offices as hereditary privileges rather than spiritual responsibilities, creating conditions ripe for conspiracy and violence. The opposition to Leo coalesced around the nephews of his predecessor, Pascal and Campulus, who believed they had stronger claims to papal authority than the man who had actually been elected. These ambitious clerics possessed both the family connections and the financial resources necessary to challenge Leo's position, but they lacked the military power needed to seize control of Rome by force. Their solution was to seek external support, while simultaneously working to undermine Leo's credibility through accusations of moral corruption and administrative incompetence. The charges leveled against Leo reflected the standard repertoire of medieval political warfare, combining plausible accusations with fantastic claims designed to destroy his reputation among both clerical and secular audiences. His enemies alleged that he had committed adultery and perjury, crimes that would have disqualified him from holding papal office if proven true. More seriously, they suggested that his election had been invalid due to procedural irregularities and factional manipulation. These accusations created a crisis that extended far beyond the immediate question of Leo's personal fitness for office. The authority of the papacy itself was at stake, along with the broader question of who possessed the right to judge the successor of St. Peter. Medieval political theory provided no clear answers to these questions, creating opportunities for creative interpretation. that different parties would exploit according to their particular interests and capabilities. The situation exploded into violence on April 25, 799, during a papal procession through the streets of Rome. Paschal and Campulus, supported by armed followers, attacked Leo as he travelled from the Lateran Palace to the Church of St. Lawrence. The assault was both physically brutal and symbolically devastating, as the conspirators attempted to blind the Pope and cut out his tongue, injuries that would have rendered him incapable of performing his ecclesiastical duties. Contemporary accounts of the attack vary dramatically in their details, reflecting the partisan nature of most medieval historical writing. Supporters of Leo claimed that divine intervention had miraculously healed his wounds, allowing him to escape from his captors and flee Rome despite suffering injuries that should have been fatal. His enemies maintained that he had never been seriously injured at all, suggesting that the entire episode had been staged to generate sympathy and external support for his failing cause. The truth of what happened during those chaotic hours probably lies somewhere between these extreme versions. But the political consequences were clear. Regardless of the specific facts, Leo's flight from Rome created a power vacuum that his enemies were eager to fill, while also providing him with opportunities to seek assistance from external authorities who might have reasons to support papal independence against local Roman factions. Leo's decision to seek refuge with Charlemagne represented a calculated gamble that would reshape the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority throughout medieval Europe. By appealing to the Frankish king for protection and support, Leo was acknowledging that papal independence required external military backing, while also offering Charles unprecedented opportunities to influence church affairs and claim imperial prerogatives. The journey from Rome to Paderborn, where Charles was holding court during his Saxon campaigns, required weeks of dangerous travel through territories controlled by various political factions whose loyalties could not be predicted with confidence. Leo travelled with a small entourage of trusted supporters, carrying papal regalia and documents that would be essential for establishing his credibility with Frankish authorities, who might have limited knowledge of recent Roman developments. Charles's initial response to Leo's arrival demonstrated the political sophistication that had enabled his remarkable rise from regional Frankish king to European hegemon. Rather than immediately endorsing Leo's version of events or promising military intervention, Charles convened a council of advisors to examine the legal and theological questions raised by the papal crisis. This deliberative approach allowed him to gather information while avoiding premature commitments that might prove disadvantageous as circumstances evolved. The theological implications of the crisis were particularly complex, involving fundamental questions about the relationship between divine authority and human judgment that had troubled Christian thinkers since the earliest days of the Church. Could earthly authorities sit in judgment of the Pope, who claimed to be the successor of St. Peter and the Vicar of Christ on earth? If papal authority derived directly from God, then human courts had no jurisdiction over papal conduct. But if the Pope could be judged by human standards, then who possessed the authority to conduct such judgment? The legal dimensions were equally complicated, involving both canon law and secular precedents that often contradicted each other in ways that created opportunities for creative interpretation. Roman law provided some guidance about procedures for trying high officials accused of serious crimes, but these precedents had been developed for secular rather than ecclesiastical contexts. Church law offered different frameworks that emphasized spiritual rather than temporal considerations, creating additional layers of complexity. Charles's approach to these challenges revealed his growing understanding of the relationship between law and power in medieval political systems. Rather than attempting to resolve abstract legal questions through theoretical argument, he focused on practical solutions that could restore stability while advancing Frankish interests. His deliberations were guided not by legal precedent, but by strategic calculation about the long-term implications of different possible outcomes. The council that Charles convened at Paderborn included representatives from throughout his empire, reflecting his understanding that decisions about papal authority would affect all Christian communities under Frankish protection. Bishops, abbots, and secular nobles contributed their perspectives to discussions that ranged across theology, law, politics, and military strategy. The diversity of viewpoints ensured thorough examination of the issues, while also building consensus for whatever solution Charles ultimately chose to implement. The scholarly dimension of these deliberations reflected the intellectual renaissance that was transforming Frankish court culture under Charles's patronage Alcuin of York, the Anglo-Saxon scholar who had become Charles's principal educational advisor, provided theological expertise that helped frame the discussions in terms of Christian doctrine and historical precedent. Other court scholars contributed knowledge of Roman law, canonical traditions, and political theory that enriched the analysis of this unprecedented situation. The military considerations were never far from anyone's mind during these discussions, as all participants understood that any solution to the papal crisis would ultimately require enforcement through armed intervention in Rome. Charles possessed the military capability necessary for such an operation, but the costs and risks of intervening in Italian politics had to be weighed carefully against the potential benefits a successful intervention could establish Charles as the protector of Christian orthodoxy throughout Europe, but failure could damage his reputation and encourage challenges to his authority elsewhere. The decision to restore Leo to papal authority represented Charles's conclusion that the benefits of intervention outweighed the risks, but the specific terms of that restoration reflected careful attention to Frankish interests as well as papal prerogatives. Charles agreed to provide military escort for Leo's return to Rome, but he also insisted on conducting his own investigation of the charges against the Pope. This compromise acknowledged papal dignity while asserting Frankish authority over the process of resolving the crisis. The preparations for Leo's restoration required months of careful planning that demonstrated Charles's mastery of the logistical challenges involved in projecting power across vast distances. The army that would escort Leo back to Rome needed to be large enough to overawe potential opposition, while not being so massive as to appear threatening to papal independence. The diplomatic groundwork required coordination with various Italian political factions whose support or neutrality would be essential for success. The symbolic dimensions of Leo's restoration were as important as the military and political aspects, requiring careful attention to ceremonial details that would communicate appropriate messages to different audiences throughout Europe. The Pope's return to Rome needed to appear as a triumph of legitimate authority over factional rebellion, while also demonstrating Charles's role as the protector of Christian orthodoxy and ecclesiastical independence. The journey from Paderborn to Rome became a carefully orchestrated progress that showcased both papal dignity and Frankish power to audiences throughout Italy. At each stop along the route, local authorities were expected to provide appropriate honors for the papal entourage, while also acknowledging Frankish authority over the proceedings. These ceremonies served multiple purposes, building support for Leo's restoration, while also demonstrating Charles's growing influence over Italian affairs. The arrival in Rome in November 800 marked the beginning of a series of events that would transform the political landscape of medieval Europe in ways that none of the participants could have fully anticipated. Charles entered the city not merely as a foreign king providing military assistance to a beleaguered pope, but as a Christian emperor whose authority transcended regional boundaries and approached something resembling universal jurisdiction over Christian civilization. The formal investigation of charges against Leo provided Charles with opportunities to demonstrate his commitment to justice and legal procedure, while also establishing precedents for Frankish involvement in papal affairs that would influence church-state relations for centuries to come. The proceedings were conducted according to a careful combination of canonical and secular procedures that acknowledge both papal prerogatives and imperial authority over the process of reaching final judgment. The dramatic conclusion of the investigation came on December 23, 800, when Leo swore a solemn oath denying the charges against him before an assembly that included Charles, his nobles, Roman clergy, and representatives of the Roman people. This oath-taking ceremony represented more than simple legal procedure. It established a new relationship between papal and imperial authority that would have profound implications for the development of medieval political theory. The events of Christmas Day 800 followed logically from everything that had preceded them, yet they also represented a moment of transformation that would resonate through European history for centuries to come. As Charles knelt in prayer during Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo placed a golden crown upon his head, while the assembled congregation acclaimed him as Emperor of the Romans. This coronation created the Holy Roman Empire and established Charles as the legitimate successor to Augustus Caesar and Constantine the Great. The significance of this moment extended far beyond the immediate political circumstances that had brought it about. Charles had become not merely a successful barbarian king who had conquered vast territories, but the divinely sanctioned ruler of a restored Christian empire that combined Roman traditions with Germanic energy and Christian purpose. The coronation represented the culmination of everything he had worked to achieve during his remarkable rise from Frankish prince to European hegemon. Yet even as Charles accepted imperial dignity and the unprecedented responsibilities that accompanied it, new challenges were already emerging that would test his abilities as emperor in ways that differed fundamentally from anything he had experienced as king. The empire he now ruled stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe and from the North Sea to central Italy, encompassing populations whose languages, customs, and traditions reflected the full diversity of European civilization. The administrative challenges of governing such vast territories required innovations that would establish precedents for medieval imperial government, while also preserving the personal relationships and local autonomy that made effective rule possible. In an age of limited communication and transportation, Charles would need to create institutions that could function effectively across cultural boundaries, while maintaining the unity of purpose that had enabled his remarkable achievements. The cultural implications of the imperial coronation were equally significant, as Charles now possessed both the authority and the responsibility to serve as patron of Christian learning and artistic achievement throughout Europe. The scholars, artists, and craftsmen who had already begun gathering at his court would now have access to resources and opportunities that could enable achievements rivaling those of classical antiquity. The military dimensions of imperial authority would also require careful attention, as Charles now bore responsibility for defending Christian civilization against threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Muslim powers in Spain and the Mediterranean continued to pose challenges that required constant vigilance, while Slavic peoples along the eastern frontier represented both opportunities for expansion and potential sources of conflict. Most importantly, the imperial coronation had established precedents and expectations that would influence European political development long after Charles's death. The Holy Roman Empire that began with his coronation would persist for over 1,000 years, shaping the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority throughout the medieval period and beyond. The vision of Christian empire that Charles embodied would inspire countless successors, while also creating conflicts and contradictions that would challenge European unity for generations to come. The teenage concubine, who had once entered an imperial court with nothing but ambition and intelligence, had achieved something that transcended personal success or political triumph. Charles had become the architect of European identity itself, creating institutions and precedents that would influence the development of Western civilization long after his remarkable reign had ended. His story stands as one of history's most extraordinary examples of how individual vision and determination could reshape entire civilizations through the patient work of building something designed to endure across centuries. The administrative machinery that Charles constructed to govern his vast empire represented perhaps his most enduring achievement, creating systems of governance that would influence European political development for centuries after his death. The challenge of ruling territories that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Brittany to the forests of Saxony, from the North Sea ports of Frisia to the sun-baked hills of central Italy, required innovations that went far beyond the personal relationships and tribal loyalties that had sustained earlier Frankish kings. The Missi Dominici, or royal envoys, became the backbone of Charles's imperial administration, serving as his eyes and ears throughout territories too vast for any single ruler to oversee directly. These carefully chosen representatives combined the authority of imperial appointment with intimate knowledge of local conditions, creating a network of communication and control that allowed Charles to project his will across distances that would have been impossible to manage through traditional means. The selection of these royal envoys revealed Charles's sophisticated understanding of the qualities necessary for effective administration in a diverse empire. He chose men who possessed not only unquestioned loyalty to his person and policies, but also the diplomatic skills necessary to navigate complex local politics without creating unnecessary conflicts. Many of his envoys were drawn from the educated clergy, whose training in law and theology provided them with the intellectual tools necessary for resolving disputes and implementing imperial policies in accordance with Christian principles. The instructions that Charles provided to his envoys demonstrate the comprehensive nature of his vision for imperial governance. These remarkable documents, which have survived in various manuscripts, reveal a ruler who understood that effective administration required attention to every aspect of human life, from the collection of taxes and the administration of justice to the maintenance of roads and the supervision of monastic communities. The envoys were expected to investigate complaints against local officials, ensuring that imperial justice reached even the most remote corners of the empire. They supervised the collection of revenues, preventing the corruption and inefficiency that could undermine imperial finances. They monitored the condition of churches and monasteries, ensuring that religious institutions maintained the standards of learning and spiritual discipline that Charles considered essential for the health of Christian society. Perhaps most importantly, the royal envoys served as channels of communication between the imperial court and local communities, carrying Charles's commands to distant provinces, while also bringing local concerns and complaints back to the attention of imperial authorities. This two-way flow of information enabled Charles to respond to changing conditions throughout his empire, while also ensuring that his policies remained relevant to the actual needs and circumstances of his diverse subjects. The capitularies that Charles issued throughout his reign provide extraordinary insight into his approach to imperial governance, revealing a ruler whose attention to detail matched his grand strategic vision. These legislative documents addressed everything from military organization and judicial procedures to agricultural practices and educational standards, creating a comprehensive framework for Christian governance that reflected Charles's understanding of the interconnections between different aspects of social life. The military capitularies established standardized procedures for raising armies, supplying campaigns, and maintaining fortifications throughout the empire. These regulations ensured that Charles could mobilize forces quickly and efficiently when threats emerged, while also distributing the burden of military service fairly among his subjects. The system of military obligations that these documents created would influence European military organization for centuries, establishing precedents for feudal military service that would shape medieval warfare long after the Carolingian Empire had fragmented. The judicial capitularies addressed the complex challenge of maintaining consistent legal standards across territories whose traditional laws and customs differed dramatically. Rather than attempting to impose uniform legal codes throughout the empire, Charles developed sophisticated approaches that preserved local traditions while ensuring that imperial justice remained available to all his subjects. These legal innovations required careful balancing of competing claims and traditions, demonstrating Charles's political wisdom and his respect for the diverse communities that comprised his empire. The economic regulations that Charles established through his capitularies revealed his understanding that imperial prosperity required careful attention to trade, agriculture, and monetary policy. He standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, facilitating commerce, while also ensuring that tax collection proceeded according to consistent standards. His monetary reforms created stable currency systems that supported long-distance trade, while also providing imperial authorities with reliable means of accounting and financial control. The educational initiatives that Charles mandated through his capitularies represented perhaps his most far-sighted contribution to European development, establishing systems of learning that would preserve and transmit classical knowledge while also training future generations of administrators, clergy, and scholars. The Palace School at Aachen served as the model for educational institutions throughout the empire, creating networks of learning that connected remote monasteries and cathedral schools to the broader currents of intellectual development. The scholars who gathered at Charles's court came from throughout Europe, reflecting his understanding that effective governance required the best minds available regardless of their origins or backgrounds. Alcuin of York brought Anglo-Saxon traditions of scholarship that had preserved classical learning through the darkest periods of the early medieval era. Peter of Pisa contributed expertise in grammar and rhetoric that helped establish educational standards throughout the empire. Paul the Deacon provided historical knowledge and literary skills that enriched court culture, while also serving practical administrative functions. The intellectual achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance that emerged from these educational initiatives represented more than mere scholarly accomplishment. They created cultural foundations that would support European civilization through centuries of subsequent political upheaval. The standardized script that Carolingian scribes developed improved the accuracy and legibility of manuscript copying, ensuring that classical and Christian texts would survive for future generations. The educational curriculum that Charles's scholars established provided models that would influence European learning until the rise of universities in the later medieval period. The architectural projects that Charles sponsored throughout his empire served multiple purposes that reflected his comprehensive understanding of the relationship between physical spaces and political authority. The palace complex at Aachen, with its distinctive chapel modelled on the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, established architectural standards that would influence church and palace construction throughout medieval Europe. The building's combination of Roman, Byzantine, and Germanic elements created a distinctive Carolingian style that visually represented the cultural synthesis that Charles was attempting to achieve throughout his territories. The chapel at Aachen deserves special attention as perhaps the most perfect expression of Charles's vision for Christian empire. The building's octagonal design recalled both the Church of San Vitale and earlier Christian martyria, connecting Charles's reign to the great traditions of Christian architecture, while also asserting his status as heir to both Roman and Byzantine imperial traditions. The sophisticated engineering required for the chapel's construction demonstrated the high level of technical skill available to Carolingian craftsmen, while the building's rich decoration proclaimed the wealth and cultural aspirations of Charles's court. The throne that Charles used during ceremonies in the Aachen chapel embodied the complex symbolism that surrounded imperial authority in the early medieval period. Constructed of stone slabs that tradition associated with biblical and classical precedents, the throne connected Charles's rule to both Christian and Roman imperial traditions, while also asserting his unique status as the divinely appointed ruler of a restored Christian empire. The throne's simple yet imposing design reflected Charles's understanding that effective symbols of authority must communicate power without appearing ostentatious or inappropriate for Christian rulers. The religious policies that Charles implemented throughout his empire revealed his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in Christian society. His support for missionary activities among the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe extended Christian influence into territories that had never known Roman rule, creating new opportunities for cultural exchange, while also establishing strategic buffers against potential threats from nomadic peoples further east. These missionary efforts required careful coordination between military, diplomatic, and ecclesiastical authorities, demonstrating Charles's ability to integrate different aspects of imperial policy in pursuit of comprehensive strategic objectives. The monastic reforms that Charles sponsored throughout his empire addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between religious vocation and social responsibility that would influence medieval Christianity for centuries to come. The Rule of St. Benedict which Charles promoted as the standard for monastic communities throughout his territories, created frameworks for religious life that balanced spiritual discipline with practical contributions to social welfare. Benedictine monasteries became centers of learning, agricultural innovation, and charitable activity that served essential functions in medieval society, while also providing spiritual leadership for Christian communities. The economic foundations of Charles's empire required constant attention to ensure that imperial resources remained adequate for the expanding responsibilities that accompanied territorial growth and administrative sophistication. The agricultural basis of medieval wealth meant that imperial prosperity depended ultimately on the productivity of countless individual farms and estates throughout the empire. Charles's agricultural policies encouraged innovation and improvement, while also ensuring that farmers retained sufficient incentives to maintain and increase production. The commercial policies that Charles developed reflected his understanding that trade and craftsmanship were essential for imperial prosperity, even though medieval political theory often viewed commercial activity with suspicion. His support for merchants and artisans created economic opportunities that benefited both individual entrepreneurs and imperial revenues, while his regulation of markets and currencies provided stability that encouraged long-term investment and development. The diplomatic achievements that Charles accomplished during his imperial reign demonstrated his growing mastery of the complex relationships between different political authorities throughout early medieval Europe. His correspondence with the Byzantine Emperor and the Caliph of Baghdad revealed his understanding that effective imperial policy required engagement with other major powers, even when religious and cultural differences made such relationships challenging to maintain. These diplomatic initiatives established precedents for international relations that would influence European foreign policy for centuries. The relationship that Charles developed with Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, represents one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the early medieval period. The exchange of embassies between Aachen and Baghdad created opportunities for cultural and commercial exchange that benefited both empires, while also demonstrating Charles's status as a ruler whose authority was recognized throughout the known world. The gifts that the Caliph sent to Charles, including the famous elephant named Abul Abbas, became symbols of imperial dignity that impressed contemporary observers, while also facilitating diplomatic communication across vast cultural and geographical distances. The Byzantine dimension of Charles's diplomatic activities required even more delicate handling, as his assumption of imperial title had created tensions with Constantinople, where the Eastern Roman Emperor continued to claim universal authority over all Roman territories. The eventual recognition of Charles's imperial status by the Byzantine court represented a diplomatic triumph that legitimized his position, while also establishing precedents for the coexistence of multiple imperial authorities within the broader Christian world. The succession planning that occupied Charles's attention during his later years revealed his understanding that the empire's survival required institutional frameworks that could function effectively even after his personal leadership was no longer available. The division of territories among his sons reflected both Frankish traditions and practical considerations about the challenges of governing vast territories from single centers of authority. These arrangements attempted to balance family claims with imperial needs, while also providing for the continuation of effective governance after Charles's death. The educational legacy that Charles bequeathed to future generations represented perhaps his most enduring contribution to European development, creating intellectual foundations that would support cultural achievement long after his political empire had fragmented. The manuscripts that Carolingian scribes copied and preserved ensured the survival of classical and Christian texts that might otherwise have been lost during subsequent periods of political upheaval. The educational institutions that Charles established provided models for learning that would influence European culture until the rise of universities in the later medieval period. The legal innovations that Charles introduced throughout his empire created precedents for medieval jurisprudence that would influence European legal development for centuries. His approach to governing diverse populations through flexible legal frameworks that preserved local traditions, while ensuring imperial justice established patterns of legal pluralism that would characterize medieval European society. These legal achievements demonstrated that effective governance in diverse societies required sophisticated understanding of the relationship between universal principles and local customs. The military legacy of Charles's reign extended far beyond his specific battlefield victories to encompass fundamental changes in European military organization and strategic thinking. The heavy cavalry tactics that he perfected became the dominant form of medieval warfare, while his approaches to siege warfare and campaign logistics provided models that would influence military practice throughout the medieval period. More importantly, his integration of military service with land tenure created frameworks for feudal military organization that would shape European society for centuries. The cultural synthesis that Charles achieved throughout his empire represented one of history's most successful attempts to combine diverse traditions into a coherent civilization that could function effectively across vast territories and cultural boundaries. The Carolingian Renaissance that flourished under his patronage created new forms of learning and artistic expression that drew upon classical, Christian, and Germanic traditions, while also pointing toward future developments in European culture. As Charles entered the final decade of his remarkable reign, he could survey achievements that surpassed anything accomplished by European rulers since the fall of Rome. The empire he had created stretched across most of Western and Central Europe, encompassing populations whose diversity reflected the full spectrum of European civilization. The institutions he had established provided frameworks for governance that would influence European political development for centuries, while his cultural achievements had created intellectual foundations that would support European learning through subsequent periods of political fragmentation and social upheaval. Yet Charles also understood that his personal achievements, however remarkable, would mean little unless they could be preserved and transmitted to future generations through institutions capable of functioning effectively without his direct supervision. The challenge of ensuring continuity while adapting to changing circumstances would test every lesson he had learned during his extraordinary rise from Frankish prince to European emperor, requiring wisdom that transcended military genius or administrative competence to encompass fundamental understanding of what made civilizations endure across the centuries. The twilight years of Charles's reign brought both profound satisfaction and gnawing concerns about the fragility of everything he had built. By 810, the emperor, who had once seemed possessed of inexhaustible energy, was beginning to show the weight of his 70 years and the accumulated toll of decades spent in campaign and council. His towering frame, which had once dominated every room he entered, now moved with the careful deliberation of age, though his mind remained as sharp and penetrating as ever. The succession crisis that had haunted Charles's thoughts for years became increasingly urgent as his sons began dying in the natural course of events, leaving only Louis, called the Pious, as the surviving heir to an empire that had never been governed by a single ruler after its founder's death. Charles had originally planned to divide his territories among multiple heirs according to Frankish custom, but fate had intervened to create a situation that would test whether his imperial creation could survive intact under unified leadership or would fragment into competing kingdoms. Louis represented both hope and concern for the empire's future. Unlike his father, who had learned statecraft through decades of warfare and political maneuvering, Louis had been raised in the expectation of eventual rule, receiving the finest education available while being carefully shielded from some of the harsher realities that had forged Charles's character. His deep piety and genuine commitment to Christian principles promised continuation of the religious policies that had given the empire its spiritual foundation. But his temperament was more suited to contemplation than to the decisive action that imperial leadership often required. The administrative challenges facing the empire had grown more complex during Charles's later years, as the initial enthusiasm for Carolingian reforms gave way to the practical difficulties of maintaining imperial standards across vast territories with limited resources and primitive communication systems. The royal envoys, who had once served as effective instruments of imperial control, were finding it increasingly difficult to enforce consistent policies in regions where local traditions and immediate practical concerns often conflicted with directives from distant archon. The economic foundations of the empire were also showing signs of strain as the costs of maintaining imperial administration, supporting military forces, and funding cultural projects began to exceed the revenues that could be extracted from agricultural production and limited commercial activity. The treasure captured from the Avar campaigns had provided temporary relief, but Charles understood that lasting imperial prosperity required sustainable economic development, rather than dependence on plunder from successful wars. The Viking raids that began appearing along the northern coasts of the empire during Charles's final years represented a new type of challenge that his military systems had not been designed to address. These seaborne raiders struck with devastating speed at targets that had never before required serious fortification, disappearing back to their ships before imperial forces could respond effectively. The attacks demonstrated that even the most successful medieval empire remained vulnerable to new forms of warfare that exploited technological and tactical innovations. The diplomatic situation surrounding the empire was also evolving in ways that created both opportunities and dangers for Charles's successors. The Abbasid Caliphate was experiencing internal divisions that might create openings for Christian expansion, but these same divisions also eliminated the stable diplomatic partnerships that Charles had carefully cultivated with Harun al-Rashid and his court. The Byzantine Empire remained suspicious of Carolingian pretensions to universal imperial authority, creating tensions that could easily escalate into military conflict if not managed with extraordinary care. The intellectual achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance were reaching maturity during Charles's final years, producing scholars and administrators whose capabilities exceeded anything available to earlier medieval rulers. Yet this very success created new challenges, as educated men began developing their own interpretations of imperial policy and Christian doctrine, sometimes challenging the unified vision that Charles had worked so carefully to maintain throughout his diverse territories. The monastic communities that had provided essential support for Carolingian administration and culture were also experiencing growing pains, as their success attracted wealth and political influence that sometimes conflicted with their spiritual missions. The tension between worldly effectiveness and religious purity that had always existed within Christian monasticism was becoming more acute as monastic leaders found themselves wielding significant temporal power alongside their spiritual authority. The palace complex at Aachen had evolved into a remarkable center of learning and governance that attracted visitors from throughout the known world. But Charles understood that this very centralization created vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. The empire's dependence on his personal leadership and the concentration of administrative expertise at his court meant that any disruption to the palace's operations could have cascading effects throughout the imperial system. The legal frameworks that Charles had developed to govern his diverse subjects were proving their worth through decades of practical application. But they also revealed the inherent tensions between imperial unity and local autonomy that would challenge every subsequent medieval ruler. The balance between respecting traditional customs and maintaining imperial standards required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and new situations arose that existing precedents did not adequately address. The military organization that had enabled Charles's conquests was also adapting to the changing strategic environment of the early 9th century. The heavy cavalry tactics that had proved so effective against traditional opponents were being supplemented by new approaches designed to address threats from Viking raiders, Slavic tribes, and other enemies whose fighting methods differed from those Charles had encountered during his major campaigns. The cultural synthesis that the Carolingian Renaissance had achieved was beginning to influence developments beyond the empire's borders, as scholars trained in Frankish schools carried their learning to other courts and monasteries throughout Europe. This intellectual diaspora created networks of communication and shared culture that would outlast the political unity of Charles's empire, establishing foundations for European intellectual development that would persist through centuries of subsequent political fragmentation. The agricultural innovations that had supported imperial expansion were also spreading beyond Carolingian territories, improving productivity throughout Europe, while also creating economic relationships that transcended political boundaries. The three-field system, improved plough designs, and better crop rotation methods that Carolingian administrators had promoted were becoming standard practices that would support European population growth for generations to come. The architectural legacy of Charles's reign was equally influential, as the distinctive Carolingian style developed at Aachen and other imperial sites provided models that would shape church and palace construction throughout medieval Europe. The synthesis of Roman, Byzantine, and Germanic elements that characterized Carolingian architecture created new possibilities for monumental building that expressed both imperial authority and Christian devotion in ways that had not been achieved since the fall of Rome. The manuscript traditions established by Carolingian scribes were preserving and transmitting not only classical and Christian texts, but also new works of history, theology, and literature that reflected the intellectual achievements of Charles's reign. The standardized script and improved copying techniques that had been developed in imperial scriptoriums were ensuring that knowledge would survive even if the political structures that had created it eventually disappeared. The diplomatic precedents that Charles had established through his relationships with other major powers were creating frameworks for international relations that would influence European foreign policy long after his death. The principle that effective imperial leadership required engagement with other civilizations, even when religious and cultural differences made such relationships challenging, would guide medieval diplomacy for centuries to come. The religious policies that had given Charles' empire its spiritual foundation were also evolving as missionary activities extended Christian influence into new territories, while deepening the faith's impact on populations that had already been converted. The balance between forced conversion and voluntary acceptance that Charles had learned to maintain was establishing patterns for Christian expansion that would shape medieval religious development throughout Europe. The commercial networks that had developed under imperial protection were creating economic relationships that would survive political changes, while also providing foundations for the medieval trade systems that would eventually connect Europe to markets throughout the known world. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies that Charles had implemented was facilitating commerce on a scale that had not been achieved since Roman times. The educational institutions that Charles had established were beginning to produce graduates who would carry Carolingian learning to other parts of Europe, while also developing new approaches to scholarship that built upon the foundations laid during the Imperial Renaissance. The curriculum and methods developed at Aachen and other Carolingian schools would influence European education for centuries, creating intellectual traditions that would eventually evolve into the university system of the later medieval period. The legal traditions that had emerged from Charles's efforts to govern diverse populations were establishing precedents for medieval jurisprudence that would influence European law long after the Carolingian Empire had fragmented into separate kingdoms. The principles of legal pluralism and the balance between imperial authority and local custom that Charles had developed would shape medieval legal development throughout the continent. As Charles contemplated his legacy during the quiet evening hours at Aachen, surrounded by the scholars, administrators, and craftsmen who had helped him transform European civilization, he could take satisfaction in achievements that exceeded anything accomplished by medieval rulers before or since. Yet he also understood that his personal success would be meaningless unless the institutions and traditions he had created could survive the inevitable changes that would follow his death. The empire that Charles had built represented more than territorial conquest or administrative achievement. It embodied a vision of Christian civilization that combined the best elements of classical learning, Germanic energy, and Christian spirituality in a synthesis that pointed toward future possibilities for European development. The question that would determine his ultimate historical significance was whether this vision could inspire and guide future generations even after the personal leadership that had created it was no longer available. The winter of 813 brought unusual severity to northern Europe, creating hardships that tested the imperial administrative systems Charles had spent decades perfecting. The palace at Aachen, normally a bustling centre of activity even during the coldest months, took on a more subdued atmosphere as age and illness began to limit the emperor's daily activities while still preserving the essential dignity that had always characterized his public appearances. Charles had begun the delicate process of transferring authority to his son Louis, a transition that required careful attention to both legal precedents and practical politics, in order to ensure continuity of imperial governance without creating opportunities for ambitious nobles to exploit the change in leadership. The coronation ceremony that elevated Louis to co-emperor status represented one of Charles's most sophisticated political achievements, legitimizing the succession while maintaining his own supreme authority during the crucial final months of his reign. The scholars who had gathered at Charles's court during his final years were already beginning the work of recording and interpreting his achievements for future generations, understanding that their master's legacy would depend as much on how his story was told as on what he had actually accomplished during his remarkable career. The biographies, chronicles, and administrative documents that these learned men were producing would shape European understanding of imperial leadership for centuries to come. The quiet conversations that Charles held with his closest advisors during these twilight months revealed a ruler whose understanding of power and responsibility had deepened through decades of experience into something approaching wisdom. He spoke often of the temporary nature of all earthly achievements, yet also of the possibility that human effort, guided by divine providence, could create lasting benefits for future generations, even after individual leaders had passed from the scene. The final illness that claimed Charles in January 814 was brief but decisive, allowing him to make final arrangements for imperial governance while demonstrating the dignity and faith that had characterized his entire approach to leadership. His death marked the end of an era in European history, but it also marked the beginning of a legend that would inspire medieval rulers and thinkers for centuries to come. Hinkers for centuries to come. The imperial funeral that followed Charles's death became itself a masterwork of ceremonial precision that reflected everything he had taught his court about the relationship between earthly authority and eternal significance. The great chapel at Aachen, which had witnessed so many moments of triumph during his reign, now served as the stage for a farewell that would be remembered throughout medieval Europe as the proper way to honor a truly great ruler. The procession that brought Charles's body to its final resting place included representatives from every corner of his vast empire, creating a living map of European civilization that demonstrated the scope of his achievements, while also foreshadowing the challenges that would face his successors. Bishops and abbots carried relics and sacred texts, while secular nobles bore the symbols of imperial authority that Charles had wielded with such effectiveness during his 46 years of rule. The burial itself took place according to traditions that Charles had carefully established during his lifetime, combining Christian ritual with imperial ceremony in ways that honored both his spiritual convictions and his temporal achievements. The golden throne that had served as the seat of his authority was placed in the chapel vault alongside his mortal remains, creating a shrine that would attract pilgrims and inspire future rulers for generations to come. Louis the Pious inherited an empire that was simultaneously the greatest achievement of early medieval civilization and an almost impossible burden for any single ruler to bear effectively. The territories that Charles had unified through force of personality and administrative genius stretched across cultural and linguistic boundaries that created constant tensions between imperial unity and local autonomy, requiring leadership skills that few individuals in any age have possessed. The immediate challenges facing the new emperor were both practical and symbolic, involving everything from the collection of revenues and the deployment of military forces to the maintenance of diplomatic relationships and the continuation of cultural projects that had given the Carolingian court its distinctive character. Louis possessed genuine ability and sincere devotion to his father's vision, but his temperament was fundamentally different from Charles's in ways that would profoundly influence the empire's subsequent development. Where Charles had combined deep religious faith with pragmatic political calculation, Louis approached imperial governance with an intensity of Christian commitment that sometimes interfered with the practical compromises that effective rule required. His efforts to reform monastic life and clerical behavior reflected admirable spiritual aspirations, but they also created conflicts with established interests that his father had learned to manage through careful negotiation and strategic patience. The administrative systems that Charles had created proved remarkably resilient during the early years of Louis's reign, continuing to function effectively despite the inevitable adjustments required by changes in imperial leadership and evolving political circumstances. The royal envoys maintained their circuits throughout the empire. The palace school continued its educational mission, and the complex web of relationships between imperial authority and local governance remained largely intact. Yet subtle changes were already becoming apparent as different regions of the empire began to develop their own interpretations of Carolingian traditions and policies. The counts and bishops who governed distant provinces found themselves making decisions that reflected local conditions more than imperial directives, creating precedents that would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of unified imperial authority. The intellectual momentum of the Carolingian Renaissance continued to propel European cultural development, even as the political structures that had originally supported it began to evolve in new directions. The scholars who had been trained at Charles's court carried their learning to other centers throughout Europe, creating networks of intellectual exchange that transcended political boundaries, while preserving and transmitting the educational innovations that had flourished under imperial patronage. The manuscript copying projects that had been central to Carolingian cultural achievement continued to preserve and disseminate classical and Christian texts throughout Europe, ensuring that the knowledge accumulated during Charles's reign would survive even if the political unity of his empire eventually disappeared. The scriptoriums established in monasteries and cathedral schools throughout Carolingian territories maintained the high standards of accuracy and eligibility that had been developed under imperial supervision. The architectural influence of Carolingian building projects extended far beyond the immediate political boundaries of the empire, as craftsmen and designers trained in imperial workshops carried their skills to other regions where local rulers sought to emulate the magnificence of Charles's court. The distinctive style that had been developed at Aachen and other imperial sites provided models for church and palace construction that would shape European monumental architecture for centuries. The legal innovations that Charles had introduced to govern his diverse subjects continued to influence European jurisprudence long after his death, establishing precedents for medieval law that balanced imperial authority with local custom in ways that would characterize European legal development throughout the medieval period. The principles of legal pluralism and administrative flexibility that had enabled Charles to rule effectively over diverse populations became standard features of medieval governance. The economic policies that had supported Carolingian expansion and cultural achievement created foundations for medieval European prosperity that would outlast the political unity of Charles's empire, while providing models for commercial and agricultural development that would influence European economic growth for generations. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies that Charles had implemented facilitated trade relationships that would survive political fragmentation. The diplomatic precedents that Charles had established through his relationships with other major powers continued to influence European international relations long after his death, creating frameworks for negotiation and alliance that would guide medieval foreign policy through centuries of changing political circumstances. The principle that effective leadership required engagement with other civilizations, regardless of religious and cultural differences, became a permanent feature of European diplomatic thinking. The missionary activities that had extended Christian influence under Charles's patronage continued to spread the faith into new territories while deepening its impact on populations that had already been converted, creating the religious unity that would become one of medieval Europe's most distinctive characteristics. The balance between forced conversion and voluntary acceptance that Charles had learned to maintain established patterns for Christian expansion that would shape medieval religious development. The military innovations that had enabled Charles's conquests continued to influence European warfare long after his death, as the heavy cavalry tactics and siege warfare techniques that he had perfected became standard features of medieval military organization. The integration of military service with land tenure that had characterized Carolingian governance provided models for feudal military systems that would dominate European warfare for centuries. The cultural synthesis that the Carolingian Renaissance had achieved between classical learning, Christian theology, and Germanic traditions continued to influence European intellectual development long after the political unity that had originally supported it had given way to regional fragmentation. The educational institutions and scholarly methods that had been developed under imperial patronage provided foundations for medieval learning that would eventually evolve into the university system of the later medieval period. The agricultural innovations that had supported imperial expansion during Charles's reign continued to spread throughout Europe, improving productivity while creating economic relationships that transcended political boundaries and supported population growth that would characterize medieval European development. The three-field system, improved plough designs, and better crop rotation methods that Carolingian administrators had promoted became standard practices throughout the continent. The monastic reforms that Charles had sponsored continued to influence medieval religious life long after his death, as the rule of Saint Benedict and other regulatory frameworks that he had promoted provided models for religious communities that balanced spiritual discipline with practical contributions to social welfare. Benedictine monasteries remained centers of learning, agricultural innovation, and charitable activity that served essential functions in medieval society. The succession crisis that had been avoided during Charles's lifetime through careful planning and fortunate circumstances eventually emerged during Louis's reign as competing claims and regional interests began to fragment the unity that had been maintained through imperial authority and personal loyalty to the founding emperor. The division of the empire among Louis's sons would create the separate kingdoms that would dominate medieval European politics for centuries to come. Yet, even as the political unity of Charles's empire dissolved into competing kingdoms, the cultural and intellectual foundations that he had established continued to support European civilization through centuries of subsequent political upheaval and social transformation. The vision of Christian empire that Charles had embodied would inspire countless medieval rulers, while the institutions and traditions he had created would influence European development in ways that extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of his remarkable reign. The legend that grew around Charles's memory during the medieval period transformed him from a successful early medieval ruler into a mythical figure whose achievements represented the possibility of unifying European civilization under Christian leadership, guided by divine providence. The stories that were told about his exploits became part of European cultural memory, inspiring literature and art that would influence Western civilization for centuries. The historical reality of Charles's achievements was perhaps even more remarkable than the legends that grew around his memory, representing one of history's most successful attempts to create lasting institutions and cultural traditions that could survive the inevitable changes brought by time and circumstance. His transformation from Frankish prince to European emperor demonstrated that individual vision and determination could reshape entire civilizations through the patient work of building something designed to endure. The empire that Charles created lasted only briefly in its original unified form, but the precedents he established and the institutions he founded continued to influence European political development throughout the medieval period, and beyond. The Holy Roman Empire that emerged from his legacy would persist for over 1,000 years. while the cultural achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance would provide foundations for European intellectual development that would eventually contribute to the flowering of medieval learning and the emergence of modern Western civilization. The teenage prince, who had inherited a divided Frankish kingdom, had become the architect of European identity itself, creating frameworks for governance, culture, and religious life that would influence the development of Western civilization long after his remarkable reign had ended. His story remains one of history's most extraordinary examples of how exceptional individuals can transform their world through the combination of vision, determination, and the practical wisdom necessary to build institutions capable of surviving across centuries of change. The monasteries that dotted Charles's empire became repositories of knowledge that would outlast the political structures that had created them, preserving not only the classical texts that Carolingian scholars had so carefully copied, but also developing new approaches to learning that would influence European education for centuries to come. The scriptoriums attached to these religious houses continued their meticulous work long after the imperial court that had originally sponsored their activities had evolved into something entirely different. The agricultural innovations that had supported Carolingian expansion created lasting changes in European farming practices that would sustain population growth throughout the medieval period and beyond. The heavy plough that could break the tough soils of northern Europe, the three-field system that maximized land productivity, and improved methods of crop rotation became standard throughout the continent, creating surplus wealth that would support the cathedral building projects and urban development of later centuries. The trade networks that had flourished under imperial protection continued to connect distant regions of Europe long after political unity had given way to competing kingdoms and principalities. Merchants who had learned to navigate Carolingian legal systems and currency standards adapted their practices to new political realities while maintaining commercial relationships that transcended the boundaries drawn by later rulers, seeking to establish their own territorial claims. The legal principles that Charles had developed to govern diverse populations became embedded in medieval European jurisprudence in ways that influenced everything from property rights and criminal justice to marriage law and commercial regulation. The idea that effective governance required balancing universal principles with local customs became a defining characteristic of medieval political thought, shaping how rulers throughout Europe approached the challenge of maintaining authority over culturally diverse subjects. The architectural legacy of Carolingian building projects extended throughout Europe as local rulers sought to demonstrate their own legitimacy by emulating the monumental style that had been developed at Aachen and other imperial sites. Churches, palaces, and fortifications, built according to Carolingian models, appeared from Ireland to Poland, creating a distinctive European architectural tradition that combined Roman engineering techniques with Germanic decorative elements and Christian symbolic programs. The educational curriculum that had been established at the palace school became the foundation for medieval learning throughout Europe, as students trained in Carolingian methods carried their knowledge to cathedral schools and monastic institutions across the continent. The trivium and quadrivium that organized medieval education, the emphasis on Latin literacy and classical texts, and the integration of Christian theology with secular learning all reflected innovations that had been pioneered during Charles's reign. The diplomatic traditions that Charles had established through his correspondence with rulers throughout the known world created precedents for international relations that would guide European foreign policy through centuries of changing political circumstances. The idea that Christian rulers had obligations to protect their co-religionists while maintaining honorable relationships with non-Christian powers became a central principle of medieval diplomacy. The missionary activities that had extended Christian influence under imperial sponsorship continued to shape European religious development long after the political structures that had originally supported them had evolved in new directions. The methods of conversion that combined persuasion with practical benefits, the establishment of ecclesiastical hierarchies that could function independently of secular authority, and the integration of local customs with Christian doctrine all became standard features of medieval evangelization. The military innovations that had enabled Carolingian expansion influenced European warfare for centuries, as the combination of heavy cavalry, infantry support, and siege warfare techniques that Charles had perfected became the foundation for medieval military organization. The castle-building programs that would characterize later medieval defense, the chivalric ideals that would govern knightly behavior, and the integration of military service with land tenure all trace their origins to precedents established during the Carolingian period. The cultural synthesis that the Carolingian Renaissance had achieved between different European traditions created intellectual frameworks that would support medieval civilization through centuries of political fragmentation and social transformation. The idea that classical learning, Christian theology, and contemporary practical knowledge could be combined into coherent educational and cultural programs became a defining characteristic of European intellectual life. The administrative techniques that Charles had developed to govern his vast territories provided models for medieval governance that would influence European political development long after the specific institutions that had implemented them had disappeared or evolved beyond recognition. The use of written records, standardized procedures, and trained administrators became essential features of effective medieval government throughout Europe. The economic policies that had supported imperial prosperity created foundations for medieval European commerce that would enable the urban revival and commercial expansion of later centuries. The standardization of weights and measures, the establishment of regulated markets, and the protection of merchant activities all became permanent features of European economic life that would support the growth of towns and cities throughout the medieval period. The artistic achievements that had flourished under imperial patronage continued to influence European cultural development, as craftsmen trained in Carolingian workshops carried their skills throughout the continent. The illuminated manuscripts, metalwork, ivory carving, and textile production that had reached new heights of sophistication during Charles's reign provided models and techniques that would shape European decorative arts for generations. The linguistic developments that had occurred during the Carolingian period, particularly the efforts to standardize Latin for administrative and educational purposes, while preserving vernacular languages for local communication, establish patterns of linguistic diversity within cultural unity that would characterize European civilization throughout the medieval period and beyond. The technological innovations that had supported Carolingian achievements, from improved agricultural tools and building techniques to advances in manuscript production and metalworking, spread throughout Europe and continued to influence technological development long after the political unity that had originally fostered them had given way to regional competition and innovation. The social structures that Charles had created to integrate diverse populations into a unified empire provided precedents for medieval European society that would influence everything from noble obligations and peasant rights to urban organization and clerical privileges. The idea that effective governance required creating bonds of mutual obligation between different social classes became a fundamental principle of medieval political organization. The religious architecture that had been developed during the Carolingian Renaissance continued to influence church building throughout medieval Europe, as the distinctive style that combined Roman monumentality with Germanic craftsmanship and Christian symbolism provided models for ecclesiastical construction that would shape European sacred architecture for centuries. The intellectual traditions that had been established at Charles's court continued to influence European learning through the preservation and transmission of classical texts, the development of new approaches to theology and philosophy, and the creation of educational institutions that would eventually evolve into the university system that became one of medieval Europe's most distinctive contributions to world civilization. The memory of Charles himself became part of European cultural consciousness in ways that transcended the specific historical circumstances of his reign, inspiring literature, art, and political theory that would influence Western civilization long after the empire he had created had been transformed into something entirely different. The legend of Charlemagne became a symbol of the possibility that individual greatness could create lasting benefits for human civilization. The vision of unified Christian Europe that Charles had embodied would continue to inspire medieval rulers and thinkers, even as the practical reality of European politics evolved toward the competitive state system that would dominate the continent's development in later centuries. The idea that Europe possessed a fundamental cultural and religious unity, despite its political fragmentation, became a persistent theme in medieval thought that would influence everything from crusading ideology to scholastic philosophy. As we drift towards sleep in our modern world, surrounded by the complexities of contemporary life, there remains something deeply comforting about contemplating the achievements of this remarkable ruler, who transformed European civilization through the patient application of vision, determination, and practical wisdom. His story reminds us that individual effort guided by noble purpose can create lasting benefits that extend far beyond the lifetime of any single person, no matter how extraordinary their achievements might appear to their contemporaries. The empire that Charles built may have fragmented within generations of his death, but the institutions he created, the cultural achievements he sponsored, and the vision of human possibility he embodied continued to influence European development in ways that would ultimately contribute to the emergence of the modern Western world that we inhabit today. In the quiet hours between waking and sleep, his legacy offers both inspiration and reassurance that human effort devoted to worthy purposes can indeed create something greater than the sum of its parts. The gentle rhythm of historical narrative, like the steady breathing that carries us toward rest, reminds us that individual lives, no matter how brief or limited they might seem, can contribute to larger patterns of human development that extend across centuries and continents. In Charles's remarkable journey from Frankish prince to European emperor, we find reflected the eternal human aspiration to create something lasting and meaningful from the temporary materials of mortal existence. The peaceful transition from Charles's extraordinary reign to the quieter rhythms of historical remembrance invites us to consider how the seeds he planted continued to flourish across the medieval landscape long after his physical presence had departed this world. The monasteries he had established as centers of learning became the guardians of knowledge through centuries of upheaval, their libraries preserving not only the classical texts that Carolingian scholars had so carefully transcribed, but also nurturing new forms of intellectual inquiry that would eventually blossom into the great universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. In the scriptoriums of these religious houses, monks continued the patient work of copying manuscripts with the distinctive Carolingian minuscule that had revolutionized the clarity and beauty of written text. Each carefully formed letter represented not merely the preservation of knowledge, but the transmission of a cultural vision that valued learning as essential to human flourishing. The standardized script that had emerged from Charles's educational reforms made books more accessible to readers across Europe, creating networks of intellectual exchange that transcended the political boundaries drawn by his successors. The agricultural innovations that had supported the Carolingian Empire's prosperity spread throughout medieval Europe with quiet persistence, transforming how communities fed themselves and managed their relationship with the land. The heavy plough that could break through the tough clay soils of northern Europe enabled farmers to cultivate previously unusable territory, supporting population growth that would fuel the urban revival of later centuries. Villages adopted the three-field system of crop rotation that Carolingian administrators had promoted, creating agricultural surpluses that freed some members of society to pursue specialized crafts, scholarship, and artistic creation. The legal principles that Charles had developed to govern his diverse subjects became embedded in medieval European jurisprudence through processes so gradual that contemporaries barely noticed their influence. Local courts throughout the continent began incorporating Carolingian approaches to resolving disputes between different cultural groups, balancing respect for traditional customs with the need for consistent standards of justice. The idea that effective law must serve both universal principles and local needs became a cornerstone of medieval legal thinking that would eventually influence the development of common law traditions. Trade relationships that had flourished under imperial protection evolved into the commercial networks that would connect medieval Europe to markets stretching from Greenland to Constantinople. Merchants who had learned to navigate Carolingian currency standards and legal procedures adapted their practices to new political realities, while maintaining business relationships that ignored the boundaries established by competing kingdoms. The standardized weights and measures that Charles had implemented continued to facilitate commerce long after the imperial authority that had created them had fragmented into regional powers. The architectural legacy of Carolingian building projects appeared throughout Europe as local rulers sought to demonstrate their legitimacy by emulating the monumental style that had been perfected at Aachen churches rose in Ireland, Poland, and Italy that reflected the distinctive synthesis of Roman engineering, Germanic craftsmanship, and Christian symbolism that had characterized imperial construction. The octagonal design of Charles's chapel became a template for religious architecture that would influence church building for centuries, creating sacred spaces that embodied the cultural fusion he had achieved. The educational curriculum that had been established at the palace school spread throughout Europe as students trained in Carolingian methods carried their knowledge to cathedral schools and monastic institutions across the continent. The integration of classical literature with Christian theology that had characterized imperial education became the foundation for medieval learning, creating intellectual traditions that would eventually evolve into the scholastic philosophy that would dominate European thought for centuries. In the quiet halls of these educational institutions, young minds encountered the works of Virgil and Augustine, Aristotle and Jerome, learning to see connections between ancient wisdom and contemporary challenges. The trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic that organized basic education, combined with the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy that completed advanced study, provided intellectual frameworks that would shape European culture long after the political unity that had originally fostered them had dissolved. The diplomatic traditions that Charles had established through his correspondence with rulers throughout the known world created precedents for international relations that would guide European foreign policy through centuries of changing circumstances. His respectful exchanges with the Byzantine Emperor and the Caliph of Baghdad demonstrated that Christian rulers could maintain honorable relationships with representatives of different civilizations, while remaining faithful to their own religious and cultural values. These diplomatic innovations established protocols for negotiation and alliance that would become standard features of medieval international relations. The idea that effective leadership required understanding and engaging with other cultures, even when fundamental differences made such relationships challenging, became a permanent contribution to European political wisdom that would influence everything from commercial treaties to military alliances. The missionary activities that had extended Christian influence under imperial sponsorship continued to shape European religious development through methods that balanced spiritual conviction with cultural sensitivity. The approaches to conversion that Charles had refined through decades of experience with Saxon, Avar, and other populations became models for evangelization that emphasized persuasion over force while offering practical benefits that made Christian faith attractive to potential converts. Monasteries established during the Carolingian period continued to serve as centers of agricultural innovation, charitable activity, and spiritual guidance that enriched the communities surrounding them. The rule of Saint Benedict that Charles had promoted as the standard for monastic life created frameworks for religious communities that balanced contemplative practices with practical contributions to social welfare, establishing patterns of monastic life that would influence European Christianity for centuries. The military innovations that had enabled Carolingian expansion continued to influence European warfare as the heavy cavalry tactics that Charles had perfected became the foundation for medieval military organization. The integration of mounted warriors with supporting infantry and siege warfare techniques created combined arms approaches that would dominate European battlefields until the emergence of gunpowder weapons fundamentally altered military technology. The chivalric ideals that would govern knightly behavior throughout the medieval period trace their origins to the warrior culture that had flourished under Charles's patronage. The combination of martial prowess with Christian virtue, loyalty to legitimate authority with protection of the vulnerable, that would define medieval knighthood reflected values that had been cultivated in the Carolingian court and transmitted to subsequent generations through literature, ceremony, and practical example. The cultural synthesis that the Carolingian Renaissance had achieved between classical learning, Christian theology, and Germanic traditions created intellectual frameworks that would support European civilization through centuries of political fragmentation. The idea that different cultural traditions could be combined into coherent worldviews that honored the best elements of each became a defining characteristic of European intellectual life that would eventually contribute to the cultural flowering of the later medieval period. The technological innovations that had supported Carolingian achievements spread throughout Europe through networks of craftsmen and scholars who carried their knowledge across political boundaries. Improvements in agricultural tools, building techniques, manuscript production, and metalworking that had been developed during Charles's reign continued to influence technological development long after the imperial workshops that had created them had evolved into guild systems serving local markets. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the remarkable life of Charlemagne, we find ourselves contemplating a legacy that transcends the boundaries of time itself. The young Frankish prince, who inherited a divided kingdom, became the architect of European civilization, weaving together threads of classical wisdom, Christian faith, and Germanic strength into a tapestry that would clothe the continent for centuries to come. His story reminds us that individual vision, guided by noble purpose and sustained through patient effort, can indeed reshape the world in ways that echo through generations long after the builder has returned to dust.